Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Cory Clark. She is an assistant professor of quantitative social psychology at Durham University in the UK. Dr. Clark does research in moral psychology, political psychology, experimental philosophy, and motivated cognition. And she's also the co-host of Psyphilopod. I already had on the show Dr. Bo Weingard, so this is the second co-host of the show. And thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today. It's really a pleasure to everyone. So,
thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start first by talking about this thing, about the, let's say, the relationship between psychology and philosophy, and the thing about experimental philosophy, because I mean, I really love philosophy, and I've been having quite a lot of philosophers on the show, some really big ones, fortunately. But I mean, I have this love-hate relationship with philosophy, because on the one hand, sometimes I feel that people are somewhat trying to sell me snake oil in the form of speculations about human nature and the nature of reality and things like that, and then I look back and think about things that people were speculating thousands or hundreds of years ago, and how they are so different from what we know nowadays coming from science. So, I mean, I think it's really important that nowadays we have this approach of experimental philosophy, because philosophers have been more and more interested in having these sort of experimental approaches to really validate their claims instead of just doing armchair philosophy. So, I mean, after this rant, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so my understanding is that philosophers themselves are pretty divided in terms of how they feel about the experimental philosophy movement. So some of them think that their position is really just to think about these things and not to go out and test them in the real world. But I think it's a positive thing. Psychologists and philosophers answer a lot of the same types of questions. They talk about the same types of things. The biggest one probably would be morality. So I'm a fan of the experimental philosophy movement, but apparently a lot of philosophers kind of hate on it and think it's no longer philosophy anymore, and they should just go join the social psychologists. And I say, fine, come on, we'll take the experimental philosophers. But basically, it's just taking topics that are philosophy topics and testing them experimentally. So I study a lot of stuff with free will, which people think is a philosophy topic. But it turns out people have a lot of really bizarre beliefs about free will. And if we just say that they have, that people should think, for example, some particular human capacity is what is required for moral responsibility, it's good to know what people actually think and not just say, well, this is what we think they should think.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps sometimes philosophy as it has been traditionally done, let's say, perhaps it has something to do with sexual signaling, at least on the part of men, because I mean, intelligence is really one of the targets of sexual selection, particularly in men. And if I'm coming up with these original sort of weird ideas that no one else has, instead of trying to be a little bit intelligent, humble from intelligence perspective, let's say, and giving space for my ideas to be put to the test and things like that. Perhaps that's why some people get a bit frustrated when people tell to them, oh, you're coming up with all of those ideas that in science we would call hypotheses, but you really have to put them to the test, to an empirical test. And perhaps you're wrong, like 99% of the time or something like that. So,
Yeah, there might be a little bit of that going on where maybe it was a little bit easier for philosophers to come up with these ideas and then not test them because then they're not putting themselves at risk of being wrong. And then when you actually ask people what they think, turns out maybe philosophers aren't thinking the way regular people are thinking, which I think is probably usually the case. Regular people aren't nearly as careful with their use of different concepts. So there could be some of that going on. And I think people just kind of, they like what they're used to. So philosophers who've been doing philosophy for a very long time, and now experimental philosophy is coming along that's kind of new and young. And people are pretty resistant to change in general. But I think the two fields will continue to merge more and more, and I think it'll be interesting to see developments in philosophy from using some of our methods.
yeah, and I mean, people also prefer narratives to scientific data and scientific facts. I mean, those are sort of boring stuff. It's much better to just come up with an idea, like, for example, that when you reach 3 years of age, you start lusting for your mother, and then women have sort of penis envy or something like that, and the Electra complex.
Yeah, those were fun ones. Those were fun ideas. Not true, but entertaining. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so you've referred to free will, and it's one of the topics that I would like to explore here today. So, I mean, what's happening there in terms of psychology and experimental philosophy? I mean, what are the sorts of situations where people really tend to believe in free will, or at least to attribute free will to certain actions and in certain situations, and the ones where they really prefer more of a deterministic approach to things, let's say?
Yeah, so maybe the main thing that some of my work has shown is that people will attribute more free will to people when they do something morally bad. So when you want to punish another person, you need someone to hold morally responsible, and so you say they had more freedom. You're more likely to, I actually just recently replicated one of the studies from one of my papers in 2014 that I had never tried to replicate before, but it replicated very beautifully, that people say that like anti-free will research and like neuroscience is crap research when they have just read about an immoral behavior. So when they want to punish people, they're like, no, behavior isn't caused by people's brains. Like people are conscious decisions are driving everything. So I've kind of used that within experimental philosophy to deal with a problem that philosophers have been discussing, experimental philosophers specifically, about whether people are compatibilists or incompatibilists. So what do they think people need in order to be held morally responsible? And incompatibilists say that people need this ability to do at least one of two things if you hold constant everything in the past and the laws of nature. People have to be able to do at least one of two things, because how could you say someone shouldn't do something if they couldn't have not done it, right? But then compatibilist philosophers say that no, people just need the ability to basically behave according to their own rational deliberation. They don't have a gun held to their head. They're just not being externally coerced. And that's all people need. They don't actually need to be able to do two possible things. So I tried to look at this in people, and the results are just all over the place, because people don't, again, I think there's just a mistake, and people don't think the way philosophers think. They're just not careful like that. And they basically will just say that people have free will when they want people to be morally responsible. People are morally responsible when they want to hold them morally responsible, when they want to punish someone. So people just really don't seem to have a coherent idea about what free will is. Sometimes they're compatibilists, sometimes they're incompatibilists, sometimes they're probably a bunch of other things that philosophers don't even have definitions for because they make no sense. Yeah, people, I'm not saying that people don't if you push people, they might be able to come up with something about what they think free will is. But what my research has found over and over again is that at least some aspect of these beliefs is motivated by the desire to perceive humans as morally responsible.
Mm-hmm. And does that also happens when people do good deeds? That is, they perform a good action, and perhaps people also want to hold them morally responsible for what they did, but on a positive light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've looked at good actions as well, and we find a somewhat similar pattern where people, when they want to praise someone, they perceive that person as having more free will too. And what's kind of interesting is they seem to be, it's almost like their judgments for morally good actions are like more rational in some sense. They take a lot of things into consideration when deciding whether someone should be praised and whether someone had free will for a good action. Whereas for morally bad actions, they just like, no, want to punish, they get pissed, and then they attribute free will to the person. So we see something similar for good actions when they want to praise, but they also take into consideration like how atypical was this behavior and how much did this require willpower and these other things that we might associate with a more rational perspective on free will or whether something was freely performed.
Mm-hmm. And do we know anything about what happens when people are confronted with a scientific/naturalistic view of the universe as something that is deterministic? Because I mean, personally, I'm sort of a nihilist, but that's mostly because
that must be exhausting.
Yeah, but that's mostly because I'm on the 35th percentile in terms of agreeableness, and and so I have this natural propensity to piss off other people, and so basically I have this necessity to see the world burn in some way or another. but anyway, but I guess that I'm an outlier, and basically I like science because I like to use science sort of a source of post hoc rationalization to my nihilism. But
everyone does that.
But, I mean, for people in general, what happens there?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think if I have like a really good study on this. My at least when I have discussions with people, and I suppose you have these kinds of discussions with people all the time too, people don't like it. People want to think that there's some sort of like free floating self that's responsible, that's not just being, you don't want to say like manipulated, but that essentially who they are is caused by a combination of their genes and their environmental causal history. People tend not to like it. And I think there's Sean Nichols, a philosopher, who said that when people kind of came to accept this deterministic or at least naturalistic understanding of the human world and realized that humans aren't special, humans are just animals like any other animal, and our behaviors cause the same way as another animal's behavior, that's when they decided to become compatibilists. And they were like, well, no, but we still have free will, even if we are like, if all of human behavior is natural the same way all other animals' behavior is natural, and we have to follow the laws of science the same way other animals do, then we can still have free will. So I think people are motivated to reject that. They don't like it and they don't want to accept it. And then if you kind of force them to accept it, then they kind of wiggle their way out and say, no, well, we have free will anyway, which is kind of interesting. And I think you have that with a lot of compatibilist philosophers. They have sort of accepted this naturalistic understanding of human behavior, but assert that humans have free will. And even I think a lot of them that humans are sort of exceptional in their, I guess, capacity for free will, which is fair in some ways. Humans are very smart compared to other animals, but it does seem that people want to preserve this like human exceptionalism somewhat.
Right, the idea that people have a soul and things like that, and that we are free agents in the world, right, and things like that, instead, in comparison with other animals that are perhaps more mechanical, like Descartes thought
Yeah.
about them, like, right.
I have one study in a paper where I had people, so philosophers don't say that we have like a material soul, but I have a study in a paper with regular people, and I found that people will say that souls are compatible with scientific determinism. So even if the world is completely determined, we still have souls, and they can be together. We can have both at the same time. So people just say kind of interesting things. People just want to preserve their beliefs in whatever way they possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, we have these weird from a scientific perspective, of course, innate proclivity to tend to separate the mind from the body or the mind from the brain, and then we get into dualism and things like that. So, I mean, it's really, I guess, that from conversations that I've had, for example, with David C. Geary, where he talks about what he calls core knowledge, that is folk physics, folk biology, and folk psychology, or the theory of mind, that it is really innate to us to think about people and even other animals as having sort of an essence that is separated from their strictly physical appearance or characteristics, right?
Yeah. So I think this is probably true for everyone, even scientists or philosophers, people who've come to accept that humans don't have a soul and they don't have like a sort of self that's a self-caused self. It's kind of impossible to see the world that way, For people who say they don't believe in free will and we shouldn't hold people morally responsible, I can't imagine that they don't get mad at people still and think that certain people are jerks and other people are nice. And like, even if they understand that people aren't responsible for their personality in some sense, it's still hard not to judge people as though they are responsible for everything they do. Because we just have a folk idea about what causes human behavior, and it's probably almost impossible to escape that.
Right. So, and doesn't these all have a sort of a relationship with the fundamental attribution error or bias? That is the thing where we tend to use perhaps a dispositional or a situational approach to us and to other people, depending on me or them having done something good or bad, and perhaps if something bad happened to me, I tend to attribute the fault to something in the context where that happened and not to me myself. But when it comes to other people, perhaps I tend to try to make them more morally responsible, and so I tend to attribute more of a, or to have more of a dispositional approach to their behavior. Right.
Yeah, I think that is the same kind of finding. You have all of these attributions of responsibility. So how much did somebody cause something? How much control did they have? How responsible are they? People tend to blame the person more in all these different ways for something bad than for something neutral or for something good. And from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense because we want to identify bad actors and we don't want to associate with bad actors. So it's really important to pick out the bad people and then punish them or at least avoid them. So if we blame people for bad things, it's kind of like being cautious and being like, well, maybe a situation, but I can't risk it. Like if you're a bad person, I don't want you in my social group anymore. So it makes sense that people would do this from that perspective. But yes, it does appear to be a sort of cognitive error in that you can take really similar behaviors that just had neutral or bad consequences or good or bad consequences, and people will blame the person more when it's bad, or they'll say the person was more responsible when it was bad.
Yeah, I mean, you refer to evolutionary psychology, and a thing that came immediately to my mind had to do with the cheater detection device or the cheater detection module, because I think that Cosmides and Tubi talk about it as a distinct module that we have operating in our minds, and also on the other end, deception and self-deception. So we have all of these cognitive mechanisms operating on our minds that at a social level, of course, and we really have to try perhaps to deceive other people when we do something wrong, or to try to present ourselves in a better light in comparison with other people, perhaps to escalate the social hierarchy or something like that. So that's also things that we have to take into account, right?
Yeah, it could be two separate kinds of things, yeah, where you want to deny your own bad behavior, and that's so that other people will think that you're a good person, and also that you think your own self is a good person. And then on the other hand, you have this hypersensitivity to the immoral behaviors of other people. And then something may be weird with your in-group. So people who are close to you, in some cases, it's you want to give them, like if they're a family member, you don't want to judge them because you want other people to think that you have a good family, that your in-group is positive. But then it's also really important to regulate the behavior of the people you interact with. So you also need to make sure that your friends and family are good. So there are probably some conflicting motives going on there. But yeah, they could be completely separate processes. I'm just not sure.
Right. And when it comes to free will, and because later in the interview we're going to talk about political biases, do we know anything as to if liberals or conservatives, I mean, if they approach free will and determinism and compatibilism in different ways because of perhaps their different personality traits?
Yes, there are actually pretty big differences between liberals and conservatives, in that conservatives believe a lot more in free will. And they just believe more in personal responsibility in general. And this does not appear to be, I thought at first that potentially it was because conservatives tend to be more religious, and free will is a part of a lot of religions. Christianity, I think they say, God gave people free will. But I was actually just looking at this yesterday, and the relationship between conservatism and free will belief is pretty much unaffected if you control for religiosity. So it appears to be this separate thing where conservatives tend to think people are more free and more responsible for their behavior in general. Liberals less so, and they interestingly, they agree more on some other things. So you talk about scientific determinism. Liberals tend to believe in that somewhat more, but it's not that big of a difference. They both think that genes influence behavior, for example. But conservatives really think people are more, they're more capable of overcoming their genes and environment and behaving whatever way they behave. So pretty big differences there. And I have a paper that I'm working on where we say potentially it's because conservatives moralize more, that this might explain why they believe more in free will. So we have like a meta-analysis with tens of thousands of people, and we find that conservatives morally judge people more. Even we have one with like just faces. They're just looking at faces. How bad is this person? And conservatives just say the person's more bad just based on their face. And then we find they believe more in free will too. And so we're suggesting the possibility that because conservatives moralize and because they have this stronger desire to hold people morally responsible and to punish other people, conservatives are more punitive, that this might partially explain why they think people have more free will, why they're more in control of their behavior.
But do you have any data breaking down perhaps when we're talking about different people or different groups? Because I would guess that perhaps if we were to test liberals in terms of their beliefs in free will or determinism, talking about, for example, minority groups, that perhaps they would tend more toward but that goes in line with what we've just said, because I mean conservatives believe more in free will, right? But I was thinking perhaps applying specifically to certain groups that liberals perhaps would have more of a deterministic perspective when it comes to certain people that they consider to be victims in society, like minorities.
Were you looking at my Twitter? I was just tweeting about this yesterday and today. So liberals and conservatives are roughly similar in how much they say that, I think the question was like their biological makeup influences people's traits or their personality and their talents. And liberals agree with that slightly more than conservatives. They think that people's biological makeup is more important. But then we look at specific items like whether sex differences are caused by biology or sexism. And liberals think it's almost entirely sexism and not biology. So they do kind of have it seems to be slightly conflicting beliefs about how much biology influences behavior, and they seem to downplay it somewhat for certain things, and particularly group differences, and sex differences would be a big one.
Mm-hmm. So would there be any difference when it comes to believing in determinism between the liberals and conservatives, that perhaps the conservatives tend to attribute more of an biological essentialism to people in terms of attributing innate differences to people between individuals and between groups, but liberals perhaps will attribute more of an environmental determinism to people's behavior, in the sense that perhaps certain minorities, if they are disfavored, if they are part of a lower socioeconomic status, that's probably because they were exploited in the past and they come from dysfunctional families and they don't have enough state support, and because of Trump and KFC and other
KFC.
like that.
I didn't know it was KFC's fault. So liberals are more environmentally deterministic. They say situations and environment matter more than conservatives. So they would say why the reason women are underrepresented in STEM fields is, they would say, maybe almost entirely due to discrimination and social roles in society, and that biology is playing little to no role in that. And conservatives would be more likely to say biology does play some role in that. So you do kind of get, I wouldn't say one group, if one group was more supportive of genes causing things in general, it's actually probably liberals, but not when it comes to things like group differences. And then you see conservatives actually agree more that biology plays a role.
Yes, and even sometimes it seems to me that we could look at it on a case-by-case basis, because, for example, recently, and I've talked about this in my last email to you, about the APA guidelines on toxic masculinity, and it seems that
I got a good laugh out of that one. When you say my inevitable misconduct toward women.
Yeah, because it seems that they're putting it that way, right? The feminists and the APA now, this thing about toxic masculinity and men have this sort of innate proclivities toward violence and aggressiveness and things like that. And yeah, that's why nowadays I'm doing 50 whiplashes every day to really try to for the demon to go outside my body or something like that. Anyway, it seems to me at least that in certain situations they really do attribute innate differences to people that are part of different groups, even when they're talking about things like, white people can't really understand black people because they've been through different. Okay, perhaps then that's environmental because they've been through different experiences in their lives and things like that. But I mean, still, it seems to me that at least in part they attribute innate differences to different groups of people.
Yeah, they do sometimes, but it depends on the I guess topic or group or thing under question. So like, for example, if you look at homosexuality, liberals will say that's more genetically caused than conservatives. Same thing for trans people. Liberals would say it's more genetically caused. Same thing for mental health issues. Liberals say those are more genetically caused. And then you see the reversal for things like sex differences in terms of how much those are genetically caused. And it seems to me, I mean, it could be the case that, I mean, it's definitely the case that different things are different amounts of genetically caused, right? And I can't say who is more right in their selective use of genetically caused, but it seems to me that it's political for both groups, and they use them to justify their political positions in a way that appears to be a bias. But I'm still working on some stuff there, so we'll see if I can convince people once and for all that liberals are biased about these issues, because I think they are.
Right. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about biases and specifically political biases. But I mean, first of all, what is really the psychology of bias and what is bias? And I'm asking you this because I've been thinking a bit about this, and through some conversations that I've had with people, particularly last summer with Dale Purves about the cognitive neuroscience. At a certain point we were talking about visual illusions, and he told me that perhaps we calling them illusions is not the best way to talk about them, because I mean, if vision really works that way, if that is the sort of information that we capture from the environment and that our brain transforms into those sorts of mental visual representations, that perhaps it is not really an illusion, but it's simply vision, let's say, right? And with that in mind, I thought that perhaps when we talk about bias, we're more referring to things that operate in our minds, mostly at an unconscious level, that during our revolutionary history might have been very useful, the biases and the heuristics and things like that. But nowadays we call them that because of the negative consequences that they tend to have in a modern, scientific, industrialized environment, let's say. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So you're saying, like, when we take these visual illusions, if you see gray dots there and there are no gray dots there, we don't need to call it an illusion because you see the gray dots, so the dots are there or something in some sense. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, perhaps what I'm trying to say is that, okay, we don't see the world as it is, of course.
Right.
We've evolved a brain system and a nervous system that evolved to process certain types of information and to ignore other types of information and to make mental representations or to process information in ways that are that allow for us to be evolutionarily successful, that is to survive and to reproduce well enough, right?
Yeah.
Not perfectly well, but well enough. So, I mean, perhaps when we're talking about bias, I guess that first of all, most of the time we really have to rely on them because we don't have the time to really be using, let's say, as Daniel Kahneman puts it, system to stop and think and deliberate and go through the information and to not be under the influence of our biases and heuristics. So most of the time, I guess that they're pretty useful even in today's society, and we still have to rely on them. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do anything at all, pretty much, because, I mean, we don't have access to all the information that we would have to have access to in order to make perfectly reasonable and thoughtful decisions, let's say. So, I guess that what I'm trying to say here is that we tend to talk about bias with a negative connotation, like if these are errors of thinking or things that lead us astray when we're thinking about this or that and making decisions and things. So, I mean, I'm saying all of this, I'm not sure if this makes sense in any way, but what do you think about it?
I think it does make sense, and I think you're right that these biases aren't necessarily bad, and they probably were useful, and we evolved them because they were useful. So in a paper that I have under review right now, we talk about in-group biases particularly, and we argue that the reason we would evolve to have these biases that go along with our in-group loyalties because loyal members of a group would gain status in that group, and they would benefit their group, and then their group would be more likely to succeed and pass on their traits. So we want groups with loyal members, or at least for the sake of your group successfully passing on their genes, you would want a group filled with loyal members, and people who were biased in favor of their group would be more loyal. So in that sense, it's not bad. It's also not bad in the sense that, yes, a lot of the time, these are useful things. So if I am confronted with a policy and it's kind of ambiguous, I don't really know what it means, but I know my guy supports the policy. Let's say I'm a Democrat and it's a Democrat supports the policy. It makes sense for me to say, yeah, it's a good policy. Whereas if I see the exact same policy and I'm like, I don't really know what the policy means, and a Republican supports it, it makes sense for me to be like, no, that's probably not a very good policy because I don't agree with the person who supports it. So even if you gave me that experiment and you gave me the exact same policy, and I'd say good policy when my guy supports it, bad policy when someone else, we would call that a bias because you're treating an objective piece of information that's exactly the same in two conditions differently depending on how it fits with your beliefs. So this is why it's really hard. It's even really hard to call these biases in the first place, but if we do call them biases, it's not always easy to call them irrational. There are some that I think get closer to what you would probably say is irrational, but even those, so an example I like, I forget who the author is on this study, but it's people are looking at voter ballots. So there's a square, right? And you're supposed to fill in the square if it's for your guy. And there are some of the marks get contested. Is this a vote or is this not a vote? and maybe it's just like a line partially through the box, but not quite, and it's not clear whether it's a vote or not. And people will say it counts as a vote when it's for my guy, and the exact same line doesn't count for a vote when it's another guy. Now that seems like a bias. It's the exact same mark. But you could say, well, it makes sense that you think your own guy would get more votes, so the probability of it being a vote when it's for your guy is higher than when it's for the other guy. So it's really, really hard to say that these are irrational. We have some studies with order effects, which if you give people both conditions in the same study, they treat them more similarly than if you get just one or the other, which seems to indicate people know it's inconsistent to treat those conditions differently. We also have asked people, are these biases? Is it a bias to support a policy when your guy supports the policy, but not when the opposing person does? And they say, yes, it's a bias. So everyday people think that these are biases. But yes, it is a pejorative word, and I think it's because we don't want in-group favoritism affecting how people interpret the world when we have two opposing groups who need to come to solutions together, because they won't be able to converge if they're both being biased, even though you can justify these biases a lot of the time. But yeah, I think you are right that they're not necessarily bad in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I guess that perhaps what we sometimes call bias, we do that in relationship to science or the knowledge that we obtain from science. Because, I mean, if we are identifying 160 something biases and heuristics, perhaps going back to the argument made by Dale Purves, perhaps it's not illusion, it's vision, because it's simply how it works, and it's not bias, is human cognition, perhaps. I don't know.
But with vision, we don't have competing teams trying to argue for what they're seeing, right? Everyone's seeing the illusion, whereas in this case, the competition component means that biases will mean that two people can be presented with the exact same piece of information, the exact same scientific study, and one will go away thinking, yeah, I'm so right about climate change, and the other one will go away saying, I'm right about climate change, even though they completely disagree. So it seems to me that even though for an individual it makes sense to be biased, on a group level it probably is a problem, and that's why it's, to me, I think, important to understand when different groups are going to be more biased.
Well, when it comes to vision, perhaps that thing about different groups
the blue or white dress, that was one where there were competing dress.
Yeah, and I was going also to give the example of when men and women argue over the color of a handbag, for example, because sometimes women say, oh no, this is a particular sort of blue, and men look at it and say, no, this is just blue. I mean, this is just blue. What are you talking about?
I don't think I've gotten in a fight like that, but I did fight with some people over the blue or white dress thing because I thought it was white.
Oh, I also saw it as white, so
yeah,
I guess we're on the same team here. And perhaps this is
we don't have to go to war.
Yeah, perhaps this is also a liberal bias, I don't know. Okay, so, and when it comes specifically, since we're talking about groups, when it comes specifically to politics, what do political biases have in special in comparison to other biases? Because, I mean, do we also have to include here the fact that perhaps some biases, as with the case of, for example, vision, in this case, don't really lead to the formation of different factions, but when it comes to politics, perhaps we have more of a social component to these types of biases?
Yeah, I would say the two major things that make political biases different or stronger, perhaps. One is the team element, that you're part of a group and you know what your group believes and you want to be well liked in your group. And so you will tend to view the world in whatever way basically makes you well liked within your group. But then the other bit that I think makes it one of the more powerful domains of bias is that political beliefs are very often tied up in morality. So people think that the policies promoted by their group are not just right in some sort of rational way, but that they're morally right, and that people will be harmed if we don't have this policy. And so people feel really strongly about the positions that they support. And I think basically, and then I guess there's a third element that I think gets overlooked sometimes, is that policies are often ambiguous. It's really hard to know what the right thing to do is. It's hard to know which policy is going to help the most people. Do we want to help a few people and help a few people a lot and harm a lot of people a little bit? Or do we want to help everyone a teeny tiny bit? Is it okay for some people to be better off than other people? Are we not okay with that? Like, these are all, kind of judgment calls about what is good or what is going to be better or worse than something else. And you just, when you have all of these ambiguous policies with ambiguous consequences that we really can't know what's going to be the effect 10 years from now if we do this thing, it allows people to be more biased because there really isn't an objective truth. So you should just do whatever your group wants to do, because you're sort of incapable of evaluating the consequences because we don't know what they are.
Right. And I mean, this bit about morality, it's really crucial because, I mean, morality is basically behind most of the ways we organize society. And I mean, we don't have individual morality, we only have collective morality, because morality is basically the ways by which people decide to interact with one another, and it influences the ways we, or perhaps how we develop our systems of law and the social institutions that we have operating in society and the ways they operate. And I mean, it's really crucial for people that the sorts of morality that are in play in the society that they are part of really go along their preferences. Otherwise, they might go to jail just by trying to practice things that that follow along their innate preferences or proclivities and things like that, and even sometimes they have to do with very basic biological stuff like sexuality and things like that, right?
Yeah. So you're talking about how, like, in some countries, if you are a homosexual, you can go to prison. And so you're just trying to live your life and you can be in prison for it. And then, yeah, liberals were more concerned about that. And I suspect, so that one, I think that argument's been won. I think at least in most Western cultures, pretty much everyone is cool with same-sex marriage now. But at a time, there could have been a perceived trade-off. Like, we want people to be able to have relationships with the people they love, but we don't know what the consequences of making same-sex marriage legal could be. Like, maybe it would be nothing. Maybe it's just more happy people. But I think a lot of conservatives were concerned it could have this, like, a bunch of downstream consequences where more people would be harmed. So it's balancing, like, who is being helped and who is being harmed and who do we care more about. And a lot of policies are that way. Same thing with immigration. Like, we want to help people in other countries who are suffering and need our help, but we don't necessarily know what the downstream consequences are going to be of something like having open borders. What would that do? What would that do to people who already live in the country? And people will value the lives of people in the country and immigrants in different ways, and how much we are willing to accept some amount of harm for some people in order to help other people. And I think that's why it's so challenging, because both sides think that they have morality on their side, and they think that they're the ones who are trying to be helpful. They're the ones concerned about the greater good. But in many cases, it's really just hard to know. So it's really easy for people to just kind of go along with their team and think that they're the ones that have morality on their side.
And what about the effects that political biases have had on science, and particularly on social science, and even more particularly on areas like social psychology? Because I've already talked with people like, for example, Lee Jussim, and it seems that at least in many different aspects of social psychology, political biases from the liberal side have had a major impact on how people conducted research for the last several decades, right?
Yeah, so social psychologists are overwhelmingly liberal, and I think probably most or all psychologists are overwhelmingly liberal. And I think we probably always knew this, but we weren't really forced to confront it until I think like 2012 or something, when John Haidt brought it to all of our attention publicly at a SPSB in Las Vegas, I think it was. And ever since then, a bunch of new research has been popping up in all of these different domains where we thought conservatives were worse. And then we thought, well, maybe we just think they're worse because we're all a bunch of liberals, and then try to test this similar construct among liberals, and we're finding the same construct among liberals. So some examples are, there's this scale, the right-wing authoritarianism scale, and I think the person who wrote the scale said, like, it's literally impossible to find left-wing authoritarianism. It just doesn't exist. And then recently, Luke Conway created this left-wing authoritarianism scale, and he took the original scale and just changed some of the targets of the words. So, like, we should follow our liberal leaders instead of religious leaders or something like that. Pretty minor changes. And then finds that this is correlated with liberalism, and it predicts many of the same things that right-wing authoritarianism predicted. We thought conservatives were way more prejudiced than liberals. But we were looking at specific types of targets, and if you look at liberals' prejudice against pro-life people or people who are opposed to same-sex marriage, they'll be just as prejudiced as conservatives. So more and more going through all these different domains where we thought liberals and conservatives were really different and conservatives were worse, and finding that those differences might not be as big as we thought, and we just weren't really being fair in testing them.
Right. And when it comes to liberals and science, I mean, every time we try to talk about, for example, differences between men and women, differences between the races, differences between different groups of people and different populations, I mean, immediately they have sort of an allergic reaction to that. and they even use terms like, oh, biological essentialism, or, for example, the reactions that Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Leontin had to sociobiology and evolutionary psychology in its inception, let's say, where they said that basically, roughly speaking, that it would promote things like eugenics and Nazism and things like that, and even students dropped a bucket of water on the head of E.O. Wilson, I think, so, because of that. So I mean, the liberals have these sorts of biases where they really don't like that people talk about innate differences between different groups of people, particularly when they think that those differences will favor the people that they think are the oppressors.
Yes. Yep, so that's a paper that I have under review. It used to be called Equalitarianism, a Source of Liberal Bias. Now it's called Low Status Groups as a Domain of Liberal Bias or something like that. It's going through the review process. But yeah, we have, basically it's a bunch of studies that reports a gene that might explain intelligence differences either between blacks and whites or men and women, and that it's found in higher proportions in blacks or whites or men and women, and that it could explain why blacks or whites or men or women have higher intelligence. And liberals routinely rate the study as worse, and that it's implausible that genes could explain intelligence differences when they favor the privileged group, so whites or men. And conservatives actually do somewhat too. They also don't like it when we say that men might have higher IQs, but not quite to the extent that liberals do. And then they don't demonstrate the effect for race. We have another paper that we'll be writing up soon where we look at censorship, and liberals, whereas conservatives don't want to censor things that say men are better leaders than women, or women are better leaders than men, or that Christianity is violent, or that Islam is violent. They treat these things the same. Liberals want to censor things that say men are better leaders, or that Islam is violent, more than the comparison condition. So liberals are seeming to treat, they're seeming to be more biased and to treat similar information differently when that information could possibly threaten a low status group, or when it could benefit or look more favorably on a privileged or a high status group.
Right. And when it comes perhaps to openness to ideas and openness to, or even tolerance toward views that come from different people and even opposing political groups, I mean, are conservatives and liberals the same when it comes to being intolerant to those ideas? And I'm asking you this also because, as far as I know, the literature on personality psychology, when it comes to the personality traits that liberals and conservatives have, it seems to suggest, at least, I'm not sure if it's conclusive or not, but it suggests that liberals tend to be higher in openness to experience, and conservatives tend to be higher in conscientiousness, and also liberals higher in agreeableness, I think. So, but the important bit here is about openness to experience, because it seems that liberals would be more open to experience, and that would entail that they would also be more tolerant of different ideas and different views.
Yeah, so it is a bit puzzling, because I think you're right that I think it's been fairly well established that liberals score higher on openness to experience, which you'd think would predict more openness to all kinds of different ideas. There have been a few studies in recent years showing that liberals and conservatives are about equally motivated to avoid opinions that oppose their own, and that they, I think there was one where people were willing to forego the chance at winning $3 so that they could listen to things that support their views on same-sex marriage rather than listen to points that oppose them. So it is weird that we have this personality measure that is used regularly, and it seems to say liberals are more open, but then when we actually put liberals in situations, it's not obvious that they're more open towards ideas that they disagree with. It might be that they're more open about ideas that they don't have strong feelings about, but whenever you put them in a situation where it's something they have a formed opinion on, same-sex marriage, for example, or being pro-choice, that it's only in those situations where you're going to see liberals and conservatives are going to be equally not open, let's say, and maybe liberals are more open in general, or possibly liberals have some other tendency that predicts less openness in certain domains and they counteract each other. I don't know. I do think it's a puzzle, and I don't think we quite know yet what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be very interesting if people approach those kinds of studies, breaking down openness to experience in its two different facets or aspects, in terms of in terms of intellect or openness to ideas, and openness to aesthetics, I think, is the other facet. Because I guess that perhaps if people were to do that, they would find interesting the results and differences between conservatives and liberals. Because, I mean, liberals talk a lot, at least nowadays, and I guess that traditionally as well, about diversity, and they want more diversity and more inclusivity, and they want people from different groups.
Some people say it's selective diversity, though, because they don't want conservatives.
Right, but that's what I was trying to get at, because they want diversity, but a very specific kind of diversity, like, for example, sex diversity or gender diversity, racial diversity, nationality diversity, religious diversity. So they seem to want diversity in terms of people.
Do they want all religious diversity, though, or? Because I suspect they don't like Christians.
Okay, perhaps that's a bit too far to go, but they seem to prefer Muslims nowadays. And it's also a bit tricky, that part of, for example, feminists liking people that hold religious views that, at least nowadays, are much more oppressive toward women than Christianity and other religions. But anyway, going back to what I was saying before I lose my train of thought, I was saying that perhaps the sort of diversity that liberals want is more of I'm not sure the words that I should use here, but perhaps a superficial one, in terms of I want people that have that are different in terms of their aspect, their physical aspect, for example, when it comes to the races and the sexes and things like that. But when it comes specifically to intellectual diversity, I think that there's when things break down, but because it doesn't seem to me at all that liberals really are more tolerant toward different intellectual views than conservatives.
Yeah, I think that might be right. So, and this maybe goes back to what we were talking about before, that when it's something that they care about and they have an opinion on, they don't want someone who disagrees with them. So yes, you could take something like race, and they might be more comfortable with being around people of other races, but if those people of other races are still similar to them, they're still liberal and share their values. I don't know of what data are available on that, but I suspect there'd be something. I mean, you could even look at, there must be research on like liberals and conservatives' friends and how diverse their friends are and things like that. But I don't know if any of that gets at intellectual diversity. Do liberals surround themselves with people who have different views than they do? I suspect no. I bet liberals and conservatives are pretty similar in being surrounded by other people who agree with them on all of their most important values.
So, and what about these hypotheses, that perhaps they are not more open to ideas than conservatives, generally speaking, but perhaps it's easier for liberals to change their ideas, and once they've changed them, perhaps the ideas that they adopt, they are as tribal toward them as conservatives are. I don't know if this makes sense. But.
Are you saying that liberals change their views more frequently than conservatives?
Or perhaps it's easier for them to do so. But once they've changed their ideas, they cling to them as conservatives do, and they are as tribal about them as the other side is, let's say.
Yeah, you can see that different issues become more or less important to liberals and conservatives over time. And once those issues become important, it does seem like everybody gets to be very tribal and will. I think I was even seeing something recently about, it was an old poll about whether we should build a wall along the Mexican border in the US. And if I recall, there really weren't massive differences between liberals and conservatives. Enter Trump, and now it's this partisan issue. If you're a Trump supporter, you support everything Trump supports, and if you oppose him, you oppose everything he supports. And then people suddenly care a lot more. And I suspect this is true for anything. Once something becomes part of your partisan identity and becomes associated with whatever group you identify with, you kind of fall in line with your party and start to care about the things that they say they care about.
Yeah, and I mean, this is very difficult to establish, I think, because when we look back, historically speaking, I guess that, I mean, over the last few decades, both liberals and conservatives changed their views quite a lot. Even, for example, when it comes to things related to, for example, homosexuality, I guess that even the Democratic Party, in terms of at least some of its issues like a gay wedding and things like that, until very recently, a majority of them were also opposed to that, and then conservatives as well. But once it got politically relevant, let's say, and they allowed for or permitted gay marriage, at least in certain states, then I mean, many conservatives also nowadays they don't care that much about homosexuals marrying among themselves and things like that. So I guess that, on the other hand, this is also perhaps a discussion about beliefs that people have and beliefs that they say they have, and then the causal relationship between those beliefs and their actions. Because I mean, perhaps it's not, sometimes it's not really beliefs themselves that cause action, but people simply exhibit some sort of behavior, and then because they are part of a tribe, like a political tribe, then they come up with the beliefs that they say they hold as post hoc rationalizations, and then if the circumstances change and the behavior that their group have as a change, then they also adopt new beliefs. So I mean, do you understand what I'm trying to say here?
Are you saying that, I think you're saying that when issues become associated with their party, people will change their beliefs over time?
Yeah, and perhaps that has something to do with the ecological, environmental, social circumstances where perhaps we have adopted a certain type of behavior, but then in the new circumstances it is no longer favorable to us, and then people adopt different strategies, and then after they have adopted them, then that's when they come up with their group beliefs, let's say.
So what's an example of that happening?
Well, I mean, this is a very controversial view, let's say, but I've had on the show a philosopher, Alexander Rosenberg. I don't know if you've ever heard about him or not, but he's basically an eliminativist reductionist. That is, he doesn't believe in beliefs, even though this is somewhat contradictory.
He doesn't believe in beliefs?
Yeah, and basically he has a very interesting book that is. Well, I can't recall the title now, and I don't want to be here thinking for a while. So, but basically, he has a book where he refers to the foot binding practice that people had in China until very recently, and he basically tries to explain it only through evolutionary game theory, without having to rely on any beliefs that people had on their minds. And so basically the narrative that he gives is that, so when it comes to foot binding, the biological basis to it is basically paternity uncertainty on the part of men, and so they would develop certain mechanisms, certain cultural mechanisms to try to control the sexual behavior of their women. And in this case, for some reason or another, perhaps because of the technology that the Chinese people had available to them, they eventually developed foot binding because of this reason, because of paternity uncertainty, because...
How does foot binding help paternity certainty? Because the women can't walk around?
Yeah.
They're just not mobile?
Yeah, it's much more difficult for them to move and to perhaps find other partners when their men are away from home or something like that.
Okay. But you could say the same thing of the burqa. I suppose it makes it harder for them to find people who would want to mate with them because they don't know what they look like, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, Gad Saad also talks about these from a psychological, evolutionary perspective. But I mean, going back to foot binding, once the practice was in place, I mean, the women that went through foot binding, they were more men preferred them because they had their feet that way, and it would be more difficult for them to move around and all of that stuff. So they would make better marriage material, let's say.
Yeah.
So, and because of that, the practice simply expanded, and more people started doing it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to marry their daughters because men would only want foot-bound daughters, right? So, and
presumably women would want to have it because they want to be attractive to the opposite sex.
Yeah, they want to be attractive to men, yeah. And at a certain point, and I don't recall the details of this last part, but in the book he also explains how the practice eventually ended in China, again through evolutionary game theory, and he basically says that at a certain point it simply saturated, and because everyone was doing it, there was no single woman that was distinct from the others, and so eventually at a certain point a group of very influential people in Chinese society decided simply to drop the practice, and then because they were of higher status, they eventually influenced the others to drop it. But this happened basically because in terms of game theory, it saturated, and then I mean everyone was doing the same, and no one was able to distinguish herself from the others. So I mean, all of this just to say that there are people out there that try to explain human behavior in terms of, we have people's brains that receive information from the environment, like, for example, the ecological conditions, the social conditions, and things like that. And based on that information, our brains make certain decisions that lead us towards certain actions. And that's where the behavior that we manifest comes from. And we don't really need beliefs in terms of things that happen at a conscious level and that have a causal relationship to behavior to explain how people behave and how they change their behavior over time. And so I was referring to that just to try to make sense of the fact that even people who identify as liberals and conservatives, over time they also change their ideas, and they are still part of the liberal or the conservative tribe, right? But I mean, they don't, if the social circumstances change, then they also tend to acquire new behaviors and along with them new beliefs, and perhaps this is a matter of trying to sort out what comes first and where's the causal relationship. If people first change their behavior in accordance to the new circumstances, and then via post hoc rationalization just to try to justify their behavior to other people, particularly the ones that are part of their own group, then it's when they come up with the beliefs that they communicate to other people, or if it is the other way around. So
yeah, that's related to the social intuitionist perspective, and I don't think it's not that beliefs don't exist, it's that the things that we use to explain our behavior and our positions and our beliefs are things that we think will be persuasive to other people, and they're not necessarily the real reasons we have these positions in the first place. So I'm trying to think what a good example would be with like a particular political, well, one that people would use is like the opposition to same-sex marriage. People just didn't like it because they thought it was gross. And they just thought of, like, if you saw two men kissing, they were kind of like, I don't want to see that. And so they come to oppose it purely based on that response. And then when liberals say, well, why are you guys opposed to same-sex marriage? Then they're forced to say these things like, it could be bad for children, or it could have this domino effect, and next thing you know, we'll be supporting polyamory and like or polygamy, or people will be marrying toasters or something, and like marriage will crumble. Like, so they come up with these post hoc explanations for their beliefs when their belief is rooted in something much more what would you call it? Like fundamental or biological, or just it could have been something that evolved, some particular preference that people would have because it was beneficial at the moment. So it sounds kind of similar, and there's quite a bit of support that happens, not always, but a lot of the time, that our justifications for our positions are often just justifications, and they're not really the reason we have those beliefs in the first place.
Yeah, because I mean, it seems to me quite plausible that people, both individuals and collectives, at least over time, by being exposed to certain environmental conditions, that they would develop sort of optimized strategies to deal with other people in those conditions, right? And I mean, when it all boils down, I think, to really trying to establish, if that's even easy or possible to do, if beliefs or behaviors come first, and what influences what there, right?
Yeah, you could definitely see that with, even in the US, we have pretty nice splits. Some states are almost entirely conservative and others are almost entirely liberal. And a large part of that could be due to the different environments they're in. So there's more crime in the South, and so it would make sense that people would be more punitive, and conservatives are more punitive, and they are more supportive of, they're less interested in criminal justice reform, whereas more liberal states, people want to be more like Norway. Like, we don't really want to incarcerate people at all. We want to rehabilitate people. So that's interesting, and yeah, very much some of these differences, because you do have to think, well, what makes a liberal and what makes a conservative a conservative? Is it something fundamentally different about them? They're born with different biology, and then they're driven to become liberals or conservatives. But it could be driven by their environment as well. And if you put someone, for example, in a really dangerous community, they might become more conservative because they now have to be more punitive and want to get people who are harming society off the streets.
Yeah, this is again the question about, particularly in evolutionary psychology, the thing about pan-human nature versus variability, because I mean, on the one hand, we seem to have human universals at several different levels of human society, let's say from commonalities among the sexes throughout different cultures, to the ways people structure their societies and the technologies they produce and things like that. But on the other hand, I mean, even Cosmides and Tooby and basically the founding figures of evolutionary psychology also talk about the fact that, okay, we have these sort of common cognitive evolved machinery, right, that operate on the minds of all people throughout the globe. And perhaps what's happening sometimes is simply that we have different strategies at hand that are genetically encoded in some way or another, and when we are exposed to different environmental conditions, those conditions evoke a particular type of strategy that comes from among those several different strategies that we have evolved and that are available to us, and that perhaps we choose one or the other when we are exposed to different ecological conditions, social circumstances, and things like that.
Yeah, we evolved a biology that would interact with the environment, so you do the optimal thing given whatever circumstance you're in. Yeah. I don't know how much of that explains why people become liberals or conservatives, and then these other things that correspond to being liberal and being conservative, but that's probably a large part of it. And I do wonder how different liberals and conservatives are from the moment they're born.
Well, I mean, recently I've also talked with Randy Thornhill, and he has this, what he calls the theory, the parasite stress theory of values and sociality. And it's very interesting because basically his argument through the data that he has is that basically people in different regions of the globe, because they were exposed to different levels of parasites and other types of infectious agents, let's say, that perhaps in situations where they were exposed to higher levels of parasites, people who tended to be more conservative, that is less open to experience, less extroverted, that didn't really want to have sex with a lot of partners, but only with one or two or something like that, that perhaps they were more successful because in those circumstances, and they were selected for precisely because with their behavior they were transmitting less disease and were exposing also themselves to less disease, for example.
Do people in countries higher in parasite stress have fewer sexual partners on average?
Well, I'm not sure about the number of sexual partners, but he talks about, for example, having politically conservative views and being more in favor of monogamy, and being more, experiencing more sexual disgust, and things like that. Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I think you would predict then people would have fewer sexual partners in countries with higher parasite stress, but maybe not. Because if it
Yeah.
was really helpful, then why wouldn't more people adopt that strategy? Although maybe it could be different for men and women too, so that's challenging.
Yeah, but I think they do really have fewer sex partners, because he also talks about the effects in terms of the frequency of certain psychological traits, like I said, extroversion and openness to experience, because if they are low in those two kinds of traits, I mean, particularly if they are less extroverted, because they are less prone to go and look for more sexual partners, or to interact with lots of people sexually, or even in other types of social circumstances. So basically, what would have happened there is that, on the same region, initially we would have variation in terms of people exhibiting different psychological traits, but over time, because people who were less open to experience and less extroverted would have been exposed to less parasites and less disease, then natural selection would favor them in those environments, and so their frequency would rise over time.
Right. Yeah, so I think you would predict the thing is that I could be wrong, but I believe the countries with high parasite stress tend to be close to the equator.
Right.
And I would be surprised if they were less extroverted, but that might be, I'm not familiar enough with those data to, I guess, comment intelligently. But yeah, that is interesting. And yeah, people should be sensitive to their environment, and that should influence, and it could influence, yeah, even their political ideology.
Right, and I mean,
certainly should influence their eating behavior, right?
And I mean, earlier we were talking about liberals and conservatives' different psychological traits and innate proclivities and things like that, and even the moral foundations, and perhaps another thing that happens is simply that different individuals have different preferences deriving from them, from their psychological traits, and then those tend to attract one another, and then they form groups. That could also be a possibility, right?
Yeah, I think if I recall, someone who I went to grad school with, she was in my lab. Her dissertation was like birds of a moral feather flock together or something, and I think it was like people tend to want to date people who have similar moral foundations as them, but I think it's just people prefer to be around people who are similar to them in general, and particularly for their values and their moral values, so that would make sense.
Yeah, perhaps we have assortative mating when it comes to mating, and when it comes to groups, we would have assortative tribalism or groupishness.
Yeah, maybe.
Or something like that. Right.
Could be.
Well, okay, so, I mean, we've already done 90 minutes. I don't know.
Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to continue. I mean, I could be here the rest of the afternoon, but I guess that you would have something else to do, and later on I also have to release another interview, so I also have to do that. So anyway, do you think that perhaps there's any other dimension to these political biases that we've been talking about here that we haven't yet referred to, or?
No, I don't think so. I think my current thinking on it is really just that it would make sense if liberals and conservatives would be similarly biased, because there's no reason to think that groups mattered less for one group than the other. Liberals and conservatives, their evolutionary histories are probably pretty similar to one another. So if all groups evolved in a context of intergroup conflict, then people who were loyal group members would pass on their genes, and everyone, all humans, should be loyal. And the fact that this group loyalty predicts in-group biases, then it just makes sense that probably liberals and conservatives are roughly similar, and that we shouldn't expect one group to be drastically worse than the other.
Okay, so let's end on that note. And Psyphilopod, what else would you like to make reference to for people to follow your work on the internet?
I think that's all I've got going right now. I'm on Twitter. I'm Cory. If you want. I think people are confused because I like tweet stuff about liberals and conservatives, and people can't tell what my ideology is, I guess, because I don't really know if I have one anymore. But if you want a confused account of a person who doesn't know whether she thinks liberals or conservatives are better or worse, then follow me.
Okay, so I will be leaving all of that in the description box of the interview. And I mean, we someday have to have another conversation because these are very interesting topics, and I really love to have you on the show. So
I had a good time. I can't believe it went by so quickly.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics from a variety of fields. So just to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you can also do it via PayPal and Subscribestar. Yeah, all of the links will be in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my Patreons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jana Enninen, and my first producer, Izar Weber. Thank you for all.